like I said, this is, find a very hard lecture to give. And I think it's very hard for us to kind of understand slavery and to really face it. There's a couple reasons for that. One, I think, is just the horror, right? I mean, slavery is just really bad. Well, I'll talk more about what I mean by it being really bad shortly. But it's a horrible thing. The more you think about it, I think, and the more I think we think deeply about it, the more horrible it becomes, right? Over the years, if I studied slavery, it's become more horrifying to me, not less. So that's something to think about. But here's another thing to kind of think about too, is how if you're an American, it's so much a part of our nation's DNA, and it creates this big contradiction, right? So if you're proud of the Western heritage of Western civilization, especially ideas of rights and freedom and liberty, one of the early freedoms and liberties was the right to own other human beings. And that doesn't go well with my concept of liberty, right? I don't want to own someone else. It seems really wrong. And how do we justify that, right? How does that make sense? How do we make sense? If we look at this painting, there we go. How do we look at, we look at this painting of George Washington. This is George Washington here. And, we think about him. We think about Thomas Jefferson, who made this, the Declaration of Independence, who was key to bringing religious freedom to the United States. George Washington, of course, refused to be a dictator or king. He could have become a military dictator, but instead he helped our country go on a path towards democracy. And yet these, brilliant men somehow thought slavery was okay or a positive good, right? It's complex when you look at their ideas, how they understood it, but all of them, at the very least, thought it was morally acceptable. And this is hard for us to understand, I think. And it is, in a sense, the United States' original sin, you could say, is slavery. And like I say, it's a huge contradiction, or even, I don't know if hypocrisy is the right word, but it's a major problem that we had this idea of liberty, but also we have this freedom to have slaves. And one thing we have to note about, and I think I use this image with the idea of horror, not because it's horrible, but because the idea is that slavery is so horrible, people wanted to try and put a nice face on it, right? George Washington is in charge of this plantation, and you can see you have this nice thing where blacks and whites are together and working harmoniously, right? The African American slaves are working hard, but they also get a drink, they get a rest. You've got this, they're being well taken care of. They have nice clothing. They're in harmony. You can trust your children to be around them. They're not going to do anything mean because they're basically happy with their situation. The white overseer is out there, but he's also working. And I think it's interesting they even have the black horse and the white horse yoked together. And so it tries to create this idea of slavery as a system that's harmonious, where the races have their kind of natural place and work well together in this wonderful, benign, benevolent institution. And it's not like that at all. And I'll talk more about the reality of it. But I think the point is, it was so horrible that people had to try and create images like this to hide the horror, right? To hide just how bad it was. So, like I said, I just wanted to show, emphasize that idea of horror and this idea that this is very much a part of the Western heritage. And it's this problem within it, this idea, how do we bring together this idea of freedom and slavery? Now, what do I mean by slavery being so bad? I think it's fairly obvious, but one thing that bothers me is I find that because it's so horrible in reality, people want to hide from that. They want to minimize it. They want to say, well, it wasn't really that bad. Isn't working for low wages, isn't that kind of like slavery? It's like, well, when you work for low wages, you at least are getting wages. You still get paid. And you could change to a different job. But if you're a slave, you don't get any wages, right? Imagine if you went to work double shifts at your job and then the paycheck doesn't go to you, it goes to your owner, right? That's fundamentally unjust. That's horrible, right? That you should be expected to work, but someone else gets the fruit of your labor, right? You do the labor, they get the profit. We're going to talk later on about capitalism. And the idea of capitalism is whoever takes the risk gets the reward, right? In a sense, whoever does the work gets rewarded for it. In slavery, you do the work, but your owner gets paid. That's pretty darn terrible, right? When you think about it, that's fundamentally unjust. That you are doing work and other people profit from your work. And of course, needless to say, the work you're doing is dirty and dangerous. And, your owner probably wants to try and keep you alive to get more labor out of you, but is going to do the bare minimum to keep you alive. So it's going to be dirty, dangerous work, and you're not going to get paid. Another issue that makes it fundamentally different, I think, from the horrors that someone might go through at a bad job is the issue of family separation, right? So, this is an abolitionist cartoon, a comic that abolitionists are making. Abolitionists are people who want to abolish slavery. They've made this cartoon to criticize slavery, to say how terrible slavery is, and they're emphasizing the idea of a slave market, this idea that you can buy slaves just like you could horses and other cattle, right? That you're taking people and saying that they're no better than a horse or a cow. And that's bad enough. But also, there's this idea that you can separate their families. You can move them apart from each other, right? So you could have a husband and wife and their children. The father could go to plantation E, the mother could go to plantation B, and the three kids could go to plantation C, D, and E. They're completely separated, right? And when you think about it, that's just, again, horrible. It's horrible in theory, but if you just imagine that being taken away as a child from your parents, I have children. I can't imagine, having them sold and taken away from me. So slavery is really, really bad. Like I said, the more you think about it, the more horrible it is that someone could decide to make themselves a bit more money, they can separate you from your kids. And the last thing about it is, and what this image was trying to hide, in a sense, is that this isn't a harmonious system. Who would want to be in a system where they work for other people and aren't paid for it, right? Oh, I want to do that. No, you don't. Right? No one wants to do that. No one wants to work and let other people get the profit. No one wants to have their loved ones taken away from them on a whim or to make money. So the key thing is, for this system to work, it had to have violence behind it. The only reason slaves were willing to tolerate this, and I don't know if that's the right word, was because, you can kind of see this here, if they didn't, they could be beaten or killed. This system only works when it is underlaid by violence, right? No one would choose this. No one would accept this situation voluntarily. It only exists when violence backs it up. And you can see that by the fact that when slavery was finally in the United States, you didn't have slaves saying, oh, we won't want to be free. We want to stay slaves. There was no movement. There was no protest movement by former slaves saying we want to be enslaved again, because the system was terrible and it only exists because of violence used to maintain it. Now, that's bad. Things are going to get a little bit worse. So, first of all, what we have to emphasize is what happened in the United States was you had race-based slavery. And it was hereditary slavery. So you have race-based hereditary slavery. What do I mean by that? If you were white, you can't be a slave. If you were black, you could be a slave or you could be free, but if you were free, you were always in danger of being re-enslaved. But the key thing is here, you have race-based slavery. Only certain people are slaves. And, to make matters worse, their children are also slaves. Right? Their children are also slaves. So it's kind of a hopeless situation. Right? One thing, even if you're in a terrible situation, if you have children, you'll keep going for the sake of your kids. But it's kind of hard to keep going this when you're a slave and your kids' lives are going to be a lot like yours being a slave, which, as we talked about, is terrible. But like I said, this is race-based hereditary slavery. So you could say, this person was captured in war, so it's okay for them to be slaves, but what about their kids? Or you could say, remember I talked about the Anglo-Saxons, they enslaved people as a punishment for a crime. What crime did this child born into slavery commit? They didn't commit any crime. So how do you justify keeping people, a particular race, as slaves and enslaving their children? And the idea is what we today would call this idea of white supremacy. Or you could say in reverse, and I hate to say this, because I don't want to say it, but I got to say it, is this idea of black inferiority. But the idea was simple. How do we justify keeping black people as slaves and not letting them go free and keeping their children slaves? Well, they are inferior people. right? They're not quite fully human. And because of that, they're kind of uncivilized and they really can't take care of themselves. So they need their superiors, white European people, to take care of them, right? These people, black people, are inferior. They need superior white people to take care of them. Like I said, this is a terrible lecture. I hate talking about this stuff because it's awful. But that's the idea, right? So, like I say, it's a terrible system and it's justified with terrible ideas. Now, this comic is challenging this. This is an abolitionist comic, right? This is a comic produced by abolitionists that is criticizing this idea of white supremacy and black inferiority. You have the white couple seeing these African people of African descent, black, African American, however you want to describe them, but these slaves working hard, carrying out not only manual labor, but skilled labor, right? They're engaged in skilled trades here, right? This is a blacksmith working hard. I'm not exactly sure what this person's doing. This is a carpenter. And the white people here say, poor things, they can't take care of themselves. And this is an abolitionist cartoon. This is criticizing this idea because, of course, looking at this comic, they are taking care of themselves, right? The comic is pointing out black people are perfectly capable of undertaking skilled jobs. They are not inferior, and if you would let them, they can take care of themselves. This is why you'll get an abolitionist movement, both, of course, among black people, but also white people, because this is absurd, this idea that black people can't take care of themselves. And that's what the comic is pointing to. So what I want to emphasize here, right, so far, just to review, like I said, this is kind of terrible. It's hard for us to look at this. It's awful. It implicates, people who we would normally just be able to celebrate simply as heroes because of what they did for the country. But they participate in this really terrible system. And they had propaganda that tried to make it look nice and harmonious, but in reality it wasn't. It was all about extracting someone else's labor, taking away basic human rights by not even letting them form families, and then using violence to keep them in this terrible situation, while all the while telling them and other people that they were in this situation and treated so badly because there was something wrong with them. It's not the system that's the problem. It's you black people because you're inferior, right? That's terrible, right? I don't even want to say that. Me just trying to explain the idea. It's awful. But that was what the idea was. I say it's a very racist, it's a very terrible idea. But that's the idea. And it was used to justify very terrible things. So to continue on with this, so talking about the Middle Passage, right? So you're an African person, you've been enslaved, you're going to be taken to the New World. You have about a 1/3 chance of dying initially. As time went on, they got better at shipping slaves, so less died. It eventually got up to only 10% would die. And you could see the idea why people would die because they were just literally packed in here like sardines. And this voyage, of course, took weeks. Can you imagine being there in weeks? You can understand why many people would die. Why would they let so many people die? They could still make a profit, right? They're always counting money, right, to figure out how many slaves can they lose and still make a profit, and they're fine, as long as they lose just that number of slaves. So again, like I said, this is a terrible system. Now, one thing I should point out, again, when we think of slavery in the United States, when we think of slavery, we usually think of American-style slavery, United States slavery. That makes sense because that's where we live, most of us. But in actuality, that's only a very small minority. Only about 4% of slaves taken from Africa will go to North America, 45% will go to the Caribbean, and 46% will go to Brazil. So it's mostly going to be something that's happening in Latin America and the Caribbean islands because of the various crops that are grown there. To give you some statistics, Africa supplied 5 times as many people to the Americas as Europeans did between 1492 and 1820. 1820s, I believe, when the United States banned the slave trade. It didn't end slavery, it just stopped the trade. From overseas, you could still trade slaves within the United States. You could bring more from Africa. But Africa would supply 5 times as many people to the Americas as Europe. So during this time period, so that every 1 European came, 5 Africans came. And just again to show you how terrible slavery is, we had this basic question: why then are there not more people of African descent, right? Why is it that for much of the nation's history, right, people of European descent, white people will be the majority, not African people, when you've got 5 times as many Africans coming as Europeans, right? There should be a lot more people of African descent, right? There should be a lot more African Americans than there are now. Well, there's reasons for this. First of all, very few women were actually brought over. It was mostly men, right? It was mostly men. Basically, they wanted, and this isn't just U.S. slavery, right? This is just in general. Much of the slavery that was, people were brought over to grow coffee, to grow cotton, to grow sugarcane, which are very labor-intensive products, and men were considered, better suited to that kind of hard labor. So it was mostly men that were being brought over. And of course, if you've got men without women, they're going to die without children, right? They're usually going to die without offspring. Now, you may say to yourself, well, wouldn't it be profitable to allow slaves to have families and then have kids and then raise those kids as slaves, right? And I mean, that's a terrible idea, but in history, we have to try and understand, why didn't people do that? And the answer was, it was just cheaper to buy more than to allow them to raise their families. Again, it's really weird to talk about degrees of awfulness, but the one thing worse than American slavery was Caribbean slavery, because in the Caribbean, usually a slave lasted about 5 to 10 years before they died, because the work was so terrible. Working sugarcane is very, very difficult, very dangerous. And people just sat down and did the calculations. It was just cheaper to buy more slaves than to allow them to raise families. Now, that's not always going to be the case. But in areas where the slave trade ended, or where slavery was more easily observable, that's when they're going to be allowed to have families. Right? Makes sense, right? If slave trade ends, such as the United States by 1820, we still want to keep a supply of slaves, so we're going to have to let them form families. I say this is just really terrible. I really hate this lecture. And here's the other thing. In areas where people can see slavery who aren't slaves, they're going to see this kind of thing and criticize it. So you can think about in the American colonies or the United States later on, you could go from a free state or a free colony to a slave state or slave colony and see slavery and be like, this is horrible. And as a visitor, you're not making money off of it. So you just say, this is horrible, and that's just the end of the matter. And that will lead to criticism of slavery, and therefore, in order to justify slavery, the people in the southern United States that own slaves will have to be a bit nicer to them. Not very much nicer, but a bit nicer by letting them have families. I say it's really awful. But these statistics give you a sense of like how awful it was. How bad was this? Well, this many Africans came in comparison to this many Europeans, but they died without having kids. And so that's why there's not as many. That's pretty chilling, I think. So we have this question then. How could people be so cruel to other people, right? Why was it that this could happen? And I think you kind of saw it. You saw this kind of dehumanization, this kind of othering, right? You see this with these ideas of white supremacy and black inferiority, right? People of African descent, the logic goes, are lesser people. They can't really take care of themselves, so they need someone else to take care of them. And as soon as you start saying that, as soon as you dismiss someone out of hand as being childlike or inferior, you can kind of do whatever you want to them. And just say, well, I'm punishing them, but aren't I just being like a good parent, how they punish a child, right? I'm just doing it for their own good. But basically, whenever we have an ideology that allows us to dehumanize someone, we don't feel bad when we do bad things to them. I mean, that's just how it is. And unfortunately, this kind of doctrine of white supremacy dehumanized and othered people of African descent. And so people in this, the white people, the Europeans, the slave owners could do these terrible things and not feel bad about it. Another issue is simply economic. So let me give you an example. This is the example I know is from the Caribbean. But let's say you had 2,000 pounds of English money. And I don't mean like that much weight. English people use money called pounds. Like we have dollars, they have pounds. For 2,000 pounds of English money in the Caribbean, you could have bought 200 acres, a sugar mill, and 100 slaves. In a few years, that would yield 2,000 pounds a year. That's 100% return on your investment every single year. So imagine that. Imagine if you could take $1,000, scrape together $1,000, and in 3 years, you would get $1,000 every year for the rest of your life. That's insane. You cannot legally make money that way now. I don't think you can illegally make money that way right now with that much of a profit. So it's very simple. People can make money off of this. They're going to figure out a way to justify it. And one thing I have to emphasize, this was huge. Slavery was not something that was just confined to one particular region. It was central to the economy of the Americas and to Europe and to a certain extent to Africa. And you can see this if we look at, I learned about in high school is the triangular trade, but basically, in New England, they would take rum, they would bring it to Africa, sell it to buy slaves. They'd go to the Caribbean to get sugar. They would take that sugar back to New England to make rum, and they would continue doing this, making profit all the way along. British manufactured goods would be taken to Africa, exchanged for slaves, go to Virginia, sell the slaves, buy tobacco, go to Britain, buy more manufactured goods, making money each way. This was huge. A huge, significant portion of European and later American wealth is thus produced by slave labor. Right? We cannot minimize the amount of profit, the amount of wealth that these slaves of African descent produced. It was huge. It was everywhere, right? So we can't minimize slavery. And just to give you a sense of that, and I think this is very chilling, but in the U.S., 1860 census, right? So the Civil War breaks out in 1861. In the census, you were supposed to list your property. Right, in the 1860 census, there was a list of everyone had to declare their property. Slaves were valued at about $3 billion, and that's not adjusted for inflation. That's $3 billion, 1860 dollars. Right, so remember in the Civil War, I think a private in the Army, the Federal Army, made $12 a month. So you can guess $3 billion in 1860. That's a lot of money now. Wow was a lot of money in 1860. But all the value of all the slaves in the United States was equal to $3 billion. The value of all the railroads, factories, and banks was only worth $2.5 billion. Right? So think about that for a second, right? The value of these people of African descent who were enslaved was greater than all the banks, the factories, and the railroads put together. That shows us just how central this unfree labor was to the development of Western civilization. And like I said, I think it's the contradiction within that civilization. On one side, you have this belief in freedom and of liberty, but so much of the economic development in the West was brought through unfree labor, and unfree labor in a particularly cruel form. And that's something I think, as Americans, we struggle to think about. Like I said, this lecture I found very painful to give. It's just downright terrible. But it is something we have to recognize.